so much I don't have control over. Maybe I have control over far less than I suppose. That might even include my own emotional responses to things and my own mental states. Can I nevertheless embrace a kind of, or can I recognize that I have attitudinal, the ability to make attitudinal adjustments, and those attitudinal might be embracing whatever comes. I know a great teacher who says, a friend of mine wrote, it was at a lecture, asked the question, I feel like I'm trapped in a coffin sinking into the sea. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to respond to this. And this teacher said, what you need to do is you need to embrace that feeling, instead of running away from it, instead of turning from it, instead of distracting yourself from it, you need to embrace that feeling as much as you can. He said, I know it's hard. I know in a culture like ours, when we're always just looking for a medicine to treat, instead of doing that, try this, even though it'll be difficult. And he said, if you do that and you can just keep embracing that, I promise you, within about a month, you'll be like a fisherman who's in the sea, just desperately wanting to catch a fish on the end of his hook. It will, hoping to have a feeling that intense again. It will be far gone. So this has to do with this concept of amor fati,
I love it. I love it. I'm hoping we can talk more about it, especially how it applies to the book. I'm trying to make sure that I'm not letting folks in. So it looks like we're already live. Fingers crossed that we are actually live, because I can't record this for some reason. So Chris, do you see the record button on your side?
On my side, the record button? Yes, I do.
Can you select that for me? Do you mind?
Sure.
So we can have it. Okay. All right. We'll go ahead and get started. It's 12:03. Welcome to. Oh no.
Sorry, Sherry. I need to have your permission to record.
Oh, that makes sense. Let's see how we do that. I'm learning as we go here. Make co-host. How's that? Allowed to make co-host. Does that work?
Yeah, I think if you make me co-host, then I should be able to record.
There we go. I have no problem giving up control. There you go. Go for it. So we have the wonderful author. Thank you, sir. So we have the wonderful author, Mr. Clancy Martin, or Professor Martin. I prefer that. I'm going to call you that just because it seems cooler. I like it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about his work. We're going to talk about a little bit about philosophy. We started our conversation around the concept of amor fati, which is a Nietzsche term meaning being in love with one's fate. We talked about that a little bit. And so we'll kind of come back to that. But welcome to our show. We talk about creating mental wealth and the importance of healing out loud. Professor Martin has done exactly that. He's written an amazing book talking about kind of struggling with suicidal ideation for the majority of his life, and how he's managed to continue to live on. He's a professor of philosophy in Kansas City, which is super cool. I geek out about that. People who know me know I'm a huge philosophy geek, but especially how it applies to managing our own mental state and understanding kind of that stasis and the struggles that we've all been suffering with since the great philosopher's time. So thank you, Professor Martin, for being here. Why don't you introduce the audience to yourself? And before we talk about the book, let's find out a little bit about you personally.
Sherry, thank you so much for having me here on your wonderful show. And I so admire your concept of mental wealth and the work that you are doing. I really feel honored to be here. My book is called How Not to Kill Yourself, and it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek title because I have tried to kill myself a variety of times. I'm a bit of a comical character in the history of suicide because I seem to be, incapable of doing this. I guess it's a lot harder than it looks. Happily for me, I don't recommend trying it. I recommend not trying it. But yeah, I'm a philosophy professor. I'm married to the writer Amy Baradale. I have 5 children and an unruly Labradoodle, and I've lived in Kansas City for about the last 20 years or so. And I got into this because some years ago I was writing an article for a magazine called Epic, and they asked me to write about anything sort of that had to do with my life. And I wrote about, I started writing about some time I'd spent in the psychiatric hospital. And then my editor had a child attempt to commit suicide at this time. And so he said, as I look at this, I realize whenever you've been in the psychiatric hospital, it's because you tried to kill yourself. And I said, yes, that is indeed true. And he said, well, maybe you could tell us people some more about that. And so I thought this was wise advice. And so I wrote that piece. And then when it came out, and it came out in conjunction with Huffington Post, it went viral. And suddenly I had people emailing me from all over the world saying that they were Googling killing themselves, and my piece came up and they read it and they changed their mind and they decided not to kill themselves. And I don't say anything in the piece about, how sort of to go on living. I just told my own story about what it was like trying to kill myself and going through periods of wanting to die. And I realized that could be the very medicine that liberated people from this desire. I mean, people were telling me it was the medicine that they needed, and it felt so good to get those emails. And I also remembered some advice I'd been given by a great teacher years before when my first novel came out. And he said, Clancy, I love your novel, blah, 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 but you should really try to write a book that will help people. And this had stayed with me for a decade. And I was, writing all the things that I've been writing in the intervening years, but I hadn't really written something that I thought, okay, this is a book written with the idea of helping people. And suddenly I realized, hey, here's this opportunity right in front of you to actually try to help people. People are telling you that it's helping them in these moments of terrible crisis. So why don't you tell the whole story, not just the snapshot that you told in this one article, but the whole. And so that's why I wrote the book. And
I love it. I love it. I never read the article, which was gripping. I mean, I remember I couldn't stop reading it, right? It was just one of, and this is the space that I work in all the time, but it was so eloquently articulated. So even the first piece to me should be published all over, like everyone should see that. I was going to ask if that's something we could share like afterwards with the audience, just as a kind of a teaser and what to prepare them for when they buy your book. So I will tell you, I will tell you that the name of the book, though tongue in cheek, is exactly what everyone's calling scroll stopping, right? You're like scrolling through the titles of things and you're like, wait, what? So not to kill yourself. So the title of the book is definitely provocative to say, which is what people need nowadays, right? Especially with the number of people who are struggling still today, even more so, I think, at post-pandemic. So give us your take on that. Like, so you were writing this book in the midst of this pandemic. I understand you guys have a new 10-month-old, right? So you guys also have a new addition to the family. So tell me how you were able to still pull off writing this book. You're teaching philosophy at a university, writing a book, raising a family. How were you able to prioritize and finish a work this important?
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. I started really writing the book. At the time, it was in the very early stages of the book. I often teach at a university in India called the Ashoka University, which is, I guess, considered to be the best private university in India. I love to teach there. Wonderful, wonderful students. And my wife and I and our son, who was 2 at the time, were all living up in a little village and kind of high up in the Himalayas. And then I would drive down to the airport and fly in and teach for a few days and then fly back. And then COVID struck, and suddenly we were locked down in this little village in the Himalayas. And which was, in many ways a very frightening experience because there were food shortages and people were at that time very afraid of foreigners just generally, to be a foreigner was to kind of perceived to be as somebody who might be a source of COVID. So it was odd, but in some ways were good circumstances for working on a book too, because we were locked. And, so there is some of that in the book, some of the story of being in lockdown in COVID up in the Himalayas and what that was like, and watching the people and how they were processing the difficulties, some of the terrible difficulties that people were suffering from what began as a really sudden and very strict lockdown in the early stages in India. But then, we got back in the States on the 4th of July, actually, in the middle of.
Nice.
Yeah. And it was kind of a funny thing because when we left India, we had full PPE, full personal protective equipment on. It was required in order to get on the plane, and we had an N95 mask and a face shield and gloves and everything. And then we got off the plane, and when we were in Germany, they had closed the whole airport for just our flight. They were only letting in one flight at a time, and yeah, it was really something. A totally empty airport except for this one flight. All the shops closed and everything. And then we landed in Chicago, and it was just, people drinking beers. About a third of the people had masks on.
Right.
Like a normal American airport with a handful of masks mixed in. So it was very disorienting. But the thing that I was grateful for, that I'm so grateful for, that I happened to be working on this book at this particular time, is that unfortunately, as you know, as we are emerging from the pandemic, we are emerging into what in some ways is a far worse pandemic of mental health, not only here in America, but worldwide, and particularly an acute mental health crisis in kids. We used to say people ages 15 to 24. Now we've kind of broadened it to people age 10 to 24. And an awful lot of people are attempting suicide right now at unprecedented rates. And they're winding up in emergency rooms because we just don't have the mental health resources that we require to treat these people. They sit in an emergency room for 2 or 3 days, and then they get discharged, hopefully with a few prescriptions, but that's about it. And it's not enough. And so I felt, as I say, very grateful to be writing this book at this particular time when so many people are struggling with the thought of suicide, and particularly young people.
Yeah, and I know that's one of the things that you and I connected on, talked about in our conversations beforehand. First of all, and I have to give kudos to Darren Martin. Your brother is probably one of your biggest cheerleaders. I know you know that already. But I did run into him a couple of times, and each time he's like, you have to meet my brother. You have to meet him. He's doing some amazing work. And it's in alignment with what we're doing, right? And so I like that you were able to, even during the pandemic, take what was absolutely a mental wealth withdrawal for the entire planet. All of us struggled. We all went through challenges, and you took that time and decided to create something that would be a mental wealth deposit for so many people. And so I commend you for that. And I thank you for the work that you're doing, even still now, because, we know how hard it is to work in this space. There's not a lot of people like fighting us to get on stage, no, get off. I want to talk about my experiences with mental illness and our struggles. And so I commend you for the work that you're doing. I believe that there's an amazing connection to the book that you've written and the work that you do as a part of your 9 to 5. So working in philosophy, I would imagine, is a great kind of place to grab some context for what you put in the book. So talk to us a little bit about your role as a philosophy professor and working in this space to make sure that people are having better conversations about their mental health.
Well, yeah, thank you. It was a mental wealth deposit for me too, to be totally honest with you, because one thing I want to say to anyone who might be listening who either is struggling or has a loved one who's struggling, writing about these thoughts and feelings that you're having is definitely a way of making a mental wealth deposit. It will increase your ability to encounter these feelings with less fear, with less panic, with less claustrophobia, if you just write about it. And this is well established in the scientific literature on mental health generally and suicidality in particular. So writing a book about it turned out to be, this enormous mental wealth deposit for me, although it did have its challenges at times too, of course. But it's nice that you should ask about how it connects to my day job, being a philosophy professor, because just yesterday I was in my money, medicine, and morals class, which I teach every year, and it's a huge class, and there's always med students in there, and pharmacy students, and nursing students, and a lot of these people are, one way or another, going to wind up in behavioral health. Mental health, some of them in one way or another will wind up helping people with precisely the topics we're talking about. And I said, okay, trigger warning, everybody, we're going to be talking about suicide today as we're coming to the end of our class, and any other mental struggle stuff you want to talk about. And as usual, when I finally come around to this subject, and I've got this room full of 18 to 22-year-olds. Basically every hand goes up, and they all want to talk. And I even learned a new term, which I'd never heard before, which is trauma dump. You may have heard this term before, but well, I know neither had I. But anyway, the trauma dump, I guess, is when you kind of like unload all of your trauma onto one of your friends. And I guess sometimes it has a positive connotation, but sometimes it also has a negative connotation. And one of my students said, almost all of them had a story about a suicide attempt that either of a friend or one of their own. It was remarkable. They all needed to talk so much, and they needed to talk about their pandemic mental health experiences so much. And they all recognized that it was okay for them to have gone through the suffering that they had gone through, and to be talking to each other about it. They were very much affirming of each other, which was, it's just like a glorious thing for a professor when that kind of thing happens. You can see healing happening in the room. And this one student of mine said something I really liked, because they started telling me about trauma dumping. And she said, what I do is we get 4 or 5 of my friends together, and we agree to go to a restaurant, or we can even just like sit in a park or whatever. And we say, okay, for the next hour, all we're going to do is trauma dump. We're all just going to trauma dump to each other, and we're all just going to get it out of our systems. And I was like, that sounds so healthy to me, and so helpful, and such a good way of turning, as you would say, turning mental health debits, mental health withdrawals into mental wealth, into deposits. They are actually using their own mental costs to make mental deposits and mental wealth into each other's accounts. All a cooperative way of sort of all of them together collectively, taking lemons and turning them into lemonade. And it made me remember, as I always do, that young people are so resourceful if we will just be open and honest with them, and invite them into these conversations, rather than approaching them from a perspective of, okay, now we're going to tell you how to handle this problem.
Right. Yeah. Because everyone's different. And I know when I traveled and I spoke specifically about managing millennials or preparing the next generation of leaders, it was one of my favorite topics to talk about on stage, right? Is how do you engage and bring them in? And one of the first things I would say is like, when's the last time you listened, right? Like, when's the last time you listened to a younger person? And there's like silence in the room, right? Most of us as leaders, as parents, as community, we all believe we want to tell the children how to do this, how to do that, except we still don't know, right? And the pandemic to me was a way to level set. Like we all went through the same thing at the exact same time and none of us knew what to do, which is, in a way, a positive effect of COVID, right? It
Right.
gave us the opportunity to have a conversation, not as Gen Xers and baby boomers and millennials, but as human beings who all went through the same thing. And then I think millennials were already primed to have conversations different than you and I were, right?
Right.
Because one of the challenges when I coach young people when they're interviewing, I'm like, don't tell me about what the whole team did. Tell me about what you did. I want to know about your individual contribution. And it was always so hard for them because they were like, no, we went through this together. We worked on it together. So if you fast forward that to the pandemic, I think they went into it with that same perspective. We're going through this together. Let's heal through it together. And I think we have a lot to learn from the millennial generation, just in that concept, right? And not keeping everything bottled up. What do you think?
And from these Gen Z kids too, honestly, for the generation after them. I mean, I agree with you. Both generations, I think, have a much more open and welcoming attitude towards these kinds of conversations than the boomers or the Gen Xers did. And I think this is a great change for the better. But your point is also a really good one, that when it comes to the people who still at some level are largely holding the reins of power, including in mental health settings, boomers and Gen Xers, how are we being as good as they are? Are we being as open in our conversations as they are? Are we learning from them the listening skills that they have? And a friend of mine who's one of the great suicidologists in the world and who is one of the major architects of this new 988, the mental health emergency line that we have along with 911 now. His name is John Draper, and he says that he knows probably more about suicide and suicidal ideation, or as much about as anyone else alive. And he says that the single most important medicine for friends, and including for yourself if you're struggling with this, is the skill of listening. Just, particularly what the great Buddhist master Thich Nhat Hanh called deep listening. When you are listening without bringing a lot of your own convictions and your own personal baggage and agenda to the table, but just really trying to hear what that other person is saying and giving them the opportunity to have that listener. To do that, I think, is one of the most profound and spiritual things that we can do, and one of a real way of letting someone else build mental wealth, and also putting an enormous mental wealth deposit in your own mental bank account. Because when you're doing that kind of deep listening, it engenders in you a feeling of compassion and love that you might otherwise tend not to have enough of in your day,
I agree. And it's so interesting because very few people, when you hear that, and I've had interviews with, I don't know, hundreds of people since the pandemic, listening never comes up as one of the things that they choose to do, right? I mean, it's like, I'm so busy doing these things to try to catch up, to try to get back to normal, as opposed to, this is our new normal, and we should slow down and listen, and not listen to respond, but listen for the sake of just listening. And I think that that's a course that we probably need to teach at a university for adults and parents. And just, how do you listen actively, but not to solve, not to create a solution, but to just be that ear. And the work that Chris does, Chris works as a peer specialist, right? Which is the non-clinical version of people who've gone through similar lived experiences, who have that amazing capability of just listening. Because we did mention on the call before we started recording, how the age of the first attempt has gone down to 10. Right, where a young person will try as early as 10, but if they had someone that they felt they could listen to, right, and that could listen to them, and they could listen to without being scolded or judged, or, I think judged is probably the bigger issue, that gives them that safe space, right? Which is why we try to create this curriculum. So tell me a little bit more then about your university students, because we have a creating mental wealth curriculum for university students, and they tend to always be a little bit overwhelmed by the happiness, and I'm air quotes, of social media and how their lives compare to the lives of what they see on social media. So how do you think, and I know we've got to wrap in a moment, but how do you think that falls into the whole mental wealth perspective, the inundation of everything on social media?
Well, it's, I have very strong views on this subject. And when I talk to my students about it, I am happy to say, they seem increasingly aware of the perils of social media and the compare and despair threats, and threats to their own mental well-being, to their mental wealth. Whether or not they can liberate themselves, or ever in a position, given their social lives, to be free of social media in the way that some of us who are older, I'm not on social media, and I won't ever be, because I don't consider it to be good for, every time I was on it, it wound up creating a mental debit for me, not a mental credit. It took away my add to it. So I just decided several years ago, I'm just going to stay away from it, because it doesn't seem to be helpful for me. Obviously my students are not in a position to do that, but at least they seem to have more awareness now than maybe they did 5 years ago, of the fact that this can be very mentally unhealthy. They, may still be engaging in a lot of addictive behaviors when it comes to this question. But I think that for this age group, we are going to have to meet them where they are. And so we're going to have to find ways, particularly when it comes to the things that you and I are working on, find ways to help them interact with people who are sources of mental well-being online, and through where they can do this kind of thing on their phones. And people, of course, are making these efforts, but so far the efforts haven't been terribly compelling, I'm afraid. And so I think this is a challenge for the two of us. I mean, you're doing it right now. The more we can do this kind of thing, and in more and more creative ways, I think the more young people we can help. And getting them where they live, whether it's Discord or TikTok or whatever it happens to be, we've got to make the effort to do that.
It's interesting that you mentioned TikTok. So Mashera, who is our social media and marketing guru, she's like, Sherry, you got to start doing TikTok. So I was like, I don't. But I will. I understand that I do. You made a great point. Have to meet them where they are, right? I'm struggling with that one. So you're not on social media. I'm slowly trying to like ease my way into it without completely embarrassing my children, which is probably my concern more than anything. They're going to be like, oh my gosh, my mom is doing the most. But I will do whatever it takes if I believe it's going to save lives, right? And if what I'm doing will be a mental well, even if it's just from a laughter perspective, if people want to laugh at me trying to do the latest dance, and if it brings a smile to their face, absolutely. But I definitely want to thank you so much for this work that you're doing. Tell us how we can find your book, when it's available. I'm super excited to be able to support this initiative. So tell us a little bit more about where to find the book.
Oh, thank you. Well, I guess, the easiest way is just to go on Amazon. It's being published. It actually comes out in all its various formats on March the 28th of this coming year. So it's still a few months away, but you can they have the pre-order button, of course. I don't think I pre-order books very often, but it'll be in, I guess all the bookstores and things. It's still nice to go into a local bookstore and buy a book. But yeah, I hope that if people, I think if you're able to put up the link to that article that I sent you, maybe that could be helpful to anybody who's struggling. And if there anybody who's struggling or has further questions or knows someone who's struggling, please email me and just say, hey, and we can talk about it a little bit, because I have literally spent my entire life thinking about suicide. And so consequently, I think I can at least try to help and try to be a good listener, if nothing else.
Thank you so much for that. I was looking for the link so that I can post it here. We do also have a link to your book so that you can go over there and pre-order Professor Martin's book. And I did add the link to the article that you wrote so that people can read that as well. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I know this won't be the last time we chat. We'll have you back again so we can talk about, when we get closer to the book launch, so we can support you in that. And if there's ever anything we can do to help, please do. You know how to reach the entire team now. So this will go on live on YouTube. I'm not sure if it ever made it to LinkedIn. It's one of those things that my fingers are crossed that it's actually showing there. If not, we recorded it and we will upload it as soon as we're done. So Professor Clancy Martin, thank you so much for the work that you're doing to save lives one heart at a time. And thank you so much for being a part of our mental wealth movement. We're excited to have you on board. Thank you.
I'm so excited to be affiliated and to help in any way that I can, and really grateful. So thank you very, very much, Sherry.
Thank you. All right, guys. So thanks for joining us. We will see you on our next episode of LinkedIn Live. Have a happy holiday season. Bye.
Happy holidays.